Episode 5, The Weimar Constitution. Any and all information covered in this audiobook originated from the 6th chapter of the First Germany booklet. There are 3 key problems with the Weimar Constitution. Number 1, proportional representation. This allowed for the proliferation of lots of small parties, which made it hard to form a government. All governments were coalition governments. Number 2, Article 48. This gave the president emergency powers to rule the country by decree without consulting the Reichstag. The provision of emergency powers for a head of state is fairly normal. However, Article 48 ended up being used excessively. Number 3, the army, the civil service and the judiciary were not reformed. These therefore remained largely under the control of the aristocracy who, for the most part, did not support the democratic values of the new constitution. Back in November 1918, Ebert had invited the liberal lawyer Hugo Prius to draw up a new constitution for Germany, and a draft was outlined by the time the National Assembly was established in February 1919. On the 31st July 1919, the Reichstag voted strongly in favor of the Constitution, 262 for and 75 against, and PM 11 August President Ebert ratified it. A constitution sets the rule books for how the political processes in a country will work and the rights and duties of a citizen. Once they're written, or, in the case of countries like Britain, as they emerge over time, they are very hard to change, and they have very serious consequences for how political conflicts can play out. For example, in Britain, our electoral system is called first past the post. Whichever candidate in an election has most votes wins, even if they got a minority of votes. Most other countries, but not the USA or France, today have proportional representation, whereby seats in Parliament are awarded proportionally to how many people in the whole country vote for a party. This means that in Britain, majority governments are the norm, but that parties themselves, Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, are broad coalitions. If parties disagree on what to do in government, it doesn't matter enormously because the government of just one party will function. But if parties disagree within each other, the system breaks down. But in other countries, with proportional representation, the government is a coalition of different parties, and the parties themselves each represent a much narrower range of opinion. If parties can't agree to work together in this system, the system breaks down. The features of this constitution were to have long-term ramifications for the political development of the country, and we need to think about what they might be. The key features of the Weimar Constitution were electoral system and Reichstag. All men and women could vote for Reichstag, state, city, and presidential elections. This was a major change. Women could not vote beforehand, and electoral systems for states and cities meant that the SPD was almost always excluded from power. Voting would be by party lists in a proportional representation system, another major innovation. Thus, government would only work if parties could cooperate to form a stable government. Ultimately, they could not do this at national level, though they did at state level. This meant that the Reichstag was always a weak institution and vulnerable to people taking political positions. Presidency. The president would be a strong president like the US president, rather than an oversight role like the French president at that time or the British monarch. The president was directly elected by the people for a term of 7 years, so had a democratic mandate separate from the Reichstag and was in power longer than members of the Reichstag, very unlike the Kaiser. However, the president would have real powers and would be able to shape policy. He could also choose his ministers and dissolve the Reichstag. The president's powers existed over and above the Reichstag, and the president was not obliged to pick ministers from the largest Reichstag parties. This continued some of the key features of the Kaiserreich. Because the president could ensure government, it also let off members of the Reichstag parliament from taking difficult decisions and making important compromises. States. Most states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, Baden, etc., would continue to exist largely as before. This meant that 2/3 of Germany was still contained within Prussia, so there was a risk that the state government of Prussia would dominate both the Reich government and all other states. States were responsible for many areas of policy that the SPD and Zentrum were most interested in: schools, health, housing, transport. The DDP and Zentrum typically cooperated well in state governments, but not in national governments. Tax and spending. This was hugely important and a big change because in the Weimar Republic, the Reich national government raised taxes, but states Länder spent it. Previously, states had to raise their own taxes to spend on the things they control. States controlled spending on schools, health, housing, transport. The Reich was responsible for military spending and welfare benefits, employment benefit, widows' benefit, war pensions, etc. This meant that states often spent money they did not have and took on debts they could never hope to repay. Basic human rights, basic freedoms of speech, assembly, movement, thought, and expression were guaranteed by the Constitution. The Zentrum secured rights and protections for the Catholic Church, especially in education. The SPD added in rights to nationalize suitable industries without specifying what they were. It also protected private property. As such, the Constitution set up some powerful conflicts. The country was secular, but the Catholic Church could control some schools. Private property was protected, but some industries could be nationalized by the state. Everything else continued largely as before. This was a problem. Many on the right of German politics didn't want any changes at all and thought there had been too many. Many on the left of German politics wanted much more change and thought things hadn't gone far enough. The Constitution was agreed on the 31 of July and came into force on the 11th of August 1919. This was at the same time as the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated, and importantly, it was the Treaty of Versailles which attracted most of the public's attention. There was very little debate about the new constitution. It was never ratified in a vote by the people. The National Assembly approved it. Major issues in the constitution were ignored. For example, the minority SPD complained largely about Article 48, which gave the president full power in a state of emergency, which might enable some henchmen of the deposed royal family, the Hohenzollerns, to become president, declare an emergency, and rule on their own.